Good morning, fellas. Here we are,
Morning.
the last Wednesday meeting for 2020. So, boy, this New Year's celebration tomorrow night will be quite different. This is a year like no other. Of course, that has been stated millions of times this year, but a great learning experience, that's for sure. So,
Much shorter Christmas letters.
yeah. So let's get started. We're going to move on today, and let me begin here. I wrote some stuff here. So this is where we're going to focus primarily on verse 52 today, but this opening paragraph to introduce the section 52 through 58, and we'll read that entire section. This is a culmination, the ending of the discourse on the bread. And as the text reads on the screen, within the biblical critical scholarship, these guys that spend their entire careers delving into the scriptures and debating and so forth, within this circle, this arena, this portion of John's gospel account is the most controversial and hotly debated section within the entire book. This is a big one. And the debate centers around the obvious Eucharist language within this text. And of course, Eucharist is a term for what in our Protestant circles we would call the Lord's Supper. Eucharist is the Christian sacred the ceremony of celebrating the Last Supper. And Eucharist is primarily from a Catholic tradition, that term, where the emblems, the wine and the bread, the cracker, become the actual blood and body of Christ. So that's called transubstantiation, and that's from a Catholic tradition. Probably most of us here on this call, on this Bible study, would be holding to more where the emblems are symbolic and not actually transposed into the actual body and blood of Christ. But this is really where the debate centers. The tension resides in deciphering how this language got here. And basically is when it was spoken by Jesus and penned by John, they didn't have the Christian or the Catholic Mass in place. And so a lot of scholars think that this was actually inserted much later to support the traditions of the church. So there's lots of debate going on about this. And it's what this is meant to John's original readers and ultimately to all readers in all times. I mean, what Jesus is talking about here are some pretty amazing words that he uses here. So what is so ironically true, though, and I really want us to get this, is that what is happening within the story itself has been happening for a long time in relation to how to interpret the story. In the story itself, the Jews are arguing over how to interpret Jesus's words. And for centuries, all the way dating way back to probably the 3rd or 4th century, not sure on that, but this text, this story in itself has been debated. How do we interpret the words of Jesus? All efforts have been best attempts to understand, what is he saying and what does this mean for us? Much of the debate is caused by the insertion of one's own faith tradition onto and into the story in order to interpret the story. Well, that's only natural. Thus, a Catholic interpreter sees this much differently than a later Protestant interpreter. No doubt the same is true as we make our attempt to understand. We're not putting ourselves above by any means. We are confronted with the same limitations as our predecessors. And so my view of this is, let's have some fun with it. Let's explore, let's look and try to understand and make our best attempt at what Jesus is saying and what that meaning is for us as we close the year 2020 and we move to 2021. So would somebody read the text, the entire text, 52 through 58? And again, I'll remind you in context, this is the closing section, the culmination of this discourse on the bread from heaven. So would somebody read it?
Okay. Then the Jews begin to argue sharply among themselves. How can this man give us his flesh to eat? Jesus said to them, I tell you the truth, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise him up at the last day. For my flesh is real food, and my blood is real drink. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood remains in me, and I in him. Just as the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father, so the one who feeds on me will live because of me. This is the bread that came down from heaven. Your forefathers ate manna and died, but he who feeds on this bread will live forever. He said, well,
oh, go
yeah.
ahead. Bill.
And
Sorry.
I'm going to add the two verses, Mike. He said this while teaching in the synagogue in Capernaum. And on hearing it, many of his disciples said, this is a hard teaching. Who can accept it? And I assume this hard teaching they talk about, is it just this passage or everything prior in this chapter?
I don't know. I guess we'll talk about that next time. And
Okay.
10 demerits for reading ahead.
I'm sorry. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Boy, I'm really hard on you this morning, aren't I?
You are. Well, it's deservedly so. It's a good way to close out the year, and it's appropriate too.
Well, I'm laughing, just we're having fun, and I had quite a thought whether I should include verses 59 and 60. I chose to deal with the section first.
Okay.
And then we're going to move on to that. And guys, let me just prep you here. I've outlined out 3 sessions on this particular area because it's so important. And I really think it's important for us to build a basis for understanding before we actually go to the text itself. And that's what we're going to do over the next 2 weeks. I'm going to lay out an idea this morning, and then we're going to build on that next week. And then we're actually going to go to the text itself, 52 through 58, and interpret those in light of what we'll be talking about in the next couple of weeks. So that's where we're headed, and again, at glacial speed. So here's the text for today. The Jews began to argue. And I love Bill, what was your translation that you read out of there?
It's NIV.
I really liked the insertion of the word, they argued harshly. I think
Sharply,
sharply, that is the sense of what is going on here. And that reinforces kind of what my thinking has been on this. They began to argue, how can this man give us his flesh to eat? Well, naturally, I mean, it's repulsive to us. We go, what on earth is he talking about here? And then, so thus the debate. We've seen this tension before, very in the near past. In verse 41 and 42, bread from heaven, where Jesus claims to be the bread from heaven, again, tying it to the Exodus story of the manna, which was brought up by the crowd, that led to grumbling among them. And we've talked about that. They were grumbling among themselves. A new intensity is now seen through 51, verse 51c, his flesh to eat. That statement has led to argumentation. So now it's, rather than a grumbling among the troops, now they're actually finger pointing and actually various opinions and argumentation as a result of various opinions of what he's trying to say here. They're actually arguing amongst themselves, which raises the bar immensely from a grumbling level to now an argumentation. So we see tension. Now, before we move on, and that's to the interpretation of the text itself, I'd like to emphasize the context of this whole thing, the backdrop, the intent. And that intent is invitation. And I've got invitation loosely clarified as with the intent to draw people together. Okay, that's what the circle or the ellipsis is depicting, that the context of which we want to read this section is the context of invitation. I don't believe Jesus was walking around Judea trying to make people's lives miserable. I don't think he was here in the crowd trying to point his finger, pointing out error. I think Jesus was out and about declaring good news of salvation, good news, and inviting people to the party. When you and I receive an invitation, I can't imagine us grumbling or arguing what is his intent. But that was the response of invitation. He's inviting them to something larger and wonderful, and to be a joyous occasion, an invitation. And the crowd response is grumbling and argumentation. And what is happening within the text is no different than what we see in our common experience today. So now we put the two phrases within the context of invitation, and we see bread from heaven, verses 41 and 42. This is the what of the invitation. This is what they're being invited to. And that trigger number one is grumbling. The what of the invitation triggers grumbling. The how is what we're going to be diving into in the next couple of weeks. The how. How do you receive this bread from heaven? He lays it out in very interesting and somewhat repulsive language, at least to the crowd, certainly enigmatic in our understanding of what is he saying. Whoever eats me, he says, what is he talking about? And so that is what we're going to dive into. And that is trigger number two, grumbling and argumentation. So Jesus is, we're going to look at those two triggers. The Jesus offering is apples, and what the crowd hears are oranges. Apples and oranges, and you and I all know what that means. Two different wavelengths. As in one author wrote, Venus and Mars, men are from one and women are from the other. There's two different worlds going on here. And we've already looked at this, but it all culminates here in this last section where Jesus, in a sense, gets down to brass tacks. So in regard to the Jesus offering, and what you can see, these slides are set up as a contrast. We're going to use our binary mind capabilities here, and we're going to look at this from a binary perspective. Well, at least from two different perspectives. We're not going to hopefully judge here. We're going to hold it in tension and analyze it. So in regard to the what, Jesus is saying, I am offering you, crowd, and whoever believes, a new fullness of life, which can begin right now and has promise for the future. That's what, in a very loose and broad sense, is how I see Jesus making an offering to these folks. And that is clearly invitation. Here is your invitation that I am offering you, and along with the Father. I don't want to exclude that. So what is the crowd here? They, at that point in verse 41 and 42, the crowd enters into a reasoning dilemma. They're in their heads. And they're in this reasoning dilemma is in regard to his roots. Remember, well, he can't be bred from heaven. He's from Nazareth. I know his father. They built me a table, his roots, and driven by a need. Now, this is my thought. I think the whole thing is driven by a need to authenticate him using their biblical tradition. Thus, they bring up Moses and the bread from heaven. They're reaching into their reservoir of experience and tradition in order to validate him. In other words, we're going to use what we know in order to decipher whether he is worthy for us to follow or let him into our lives. So it's all about this dilemma that they're hooked up into his roots, and they start grumbling. How can this be? This is what I'm going to call a bogey. And you've heard this, probably remember the movie Top Gun. This is where you get the bogeys, the unidentified aircraft. Bogey is defined as an evil or mischievous spirit, a person or thing that causes fear or alarm. And then in military slang, as in the movie Top Gun, an identified aircraft. Bogey. So what, and put yourself in this, have you ever received an invitation and you label it a bogey? I imagine you could. There may be somebody here in the Bible study that you got invited to something and you're thinking, what is their ulterior motive here? Why am I invited to this? And as I think about it, I have had this experience when I get these things in the mail. They want to give me a free meal at the Moot House. They're inviting us to the Moot House to hear a presentation. Or, if any of you have been on vacation and do these timeshare things where they get you in the room and they won't let you out until you sign something. Or they make you feel like dirt if you don't. So I have been made feel like dirt. I even had my wife mad at me one time. I wouldn't sign.
I hate those. I hate those.
Go ahead.
I would only add one thing to your first trigger, the invitation.
Yeah.
I do think he included an RSVP.
Yeah. Well, that's actually in 2 here. So let's do the RSVP. Here's number two. In regard to the how, it's like Jesus is speaking to the crowd, you and us, you must openly and fully receive this entire offering. And after spending a lot of time studying the text here, I'm choosing these words pretty carefully. The entire offering, allowing it to enter your being and become part of you. And maybe some of you can kind of guess where I'm going to go with this. But I think that in a very general sense is what that the text that we're going to be looking at is about. Receiving him in his entirety, allowing him to become part of your being, which is an amazing, again, invitation. So we have invitation on Jesus's side. His only intent is to invite people to something. He's trying to better their lives. It's good news. And they just don't see it. Number two, when he explains the how, they go into a second reasoning dilemma. And this time it's in regard to the mechanics of how they would eat his flesh. And this is fueled by his use of the religiously repulsive language, which really kind of affects me the same way. Eat me, eat my flesh, drink my blood. Again, what is he talking about? And we're not alone. Throughout the church history, this is the most debated section within the entire book. And so now we have a double bogey. If a bogey isn't bad enough, we've got a double bogey going on here. So truly a situation before us as apples and oranges. We look at them and we look at us in our particular context in the year 2020, what all of us have experienced being part of the church, and what we have seen happen through our time and experience. This is nothing new. So we're going to go to table time with just that brief beginning here. And this morning, and you can snap this if you wish, or it's up to you. Our study today's been about a substantial communication breakdown in what Jesus is offering and what the crowd is hearing. We have described what the crowd is hearing as a bogey, thus prompting their negative response. And now here we go. There have been a number of Christian bogeys in our lifetime to which each of us have been called to respond in one way or another. We've all dealt with bogeys. And so before we move on to next week, we're gonna delve into this whole disconnect of communication. And we're going to talk about this idea of bogey and hopefully share some from our own experience. Think about this and share one of these bogey experiences with your table. And hopefully what we can talk about is, what has this experience taught you? I'm leaving it vague for a reason, openly. So let's talk about bogeys. We may talk about why do we perceive them as bogeys? That's up to you and your table. So let's go to table time, and I'll get us going here. And breakout rooms, and here we go. We'll have 3 breakout rooms. See you in a bit.
How the people line up in the lift lines and stuff like that?
Yeah, guy.
It's not that it's not that bad, actually. Well, I got there, since they live in Littleton, it's only, I got up there, about 8:45 or